Hi everybody, it's me Dante, and I'm here with my friend Amal Winter. And she is an author, and she's a doctorate of psychology with how many years of experience?
Oh my goodness, they feel like 105, but I think
105?
they're really 35.
35, wow. And I want to interview her today because she's a friend that I met through a friend of mine in Seattle, and we've done a couple channeling sessions, and what an interesting and powerful person. And she's dedicated a long time writing this book. I'm excited to read it, and yeah, can you tell us a little bit?
Well, it's an unusual book. It's best described technically as a fictional narrative in real time and space. So the story itself is fictional, but it's set in Egypt in the current time, like 2014, and takes the reader through all of the issues that I know about that are operating in the Middle East, the Islamist movement, the globalization movement, the strict class structure, the extreme poverty, and the repression and oppression by the political authorities, matched only by the violence and oppression of the terrorists who fight them.
Wow. So it's like a deep view into something that many people don't really get to see firsthand.
That's really true. My intention from the beginning was to introduce people to a Middle Eastern country that I know well, because I grew up there and my family is still there.
So you're both Egyptian and American. Like
Right.
your father was Egyptian and your mom was from.
My mother was from San Mateo with the exotic last name of Smith.
That's spicy. So I'm curious, when you say that, like, what do you think, having, this culture in America, Middle Eastern culture, and our media portrays so much about something that people in this country don't really see firsthand. What do you think is the biggest thing that you wanted to portray that's counter to the image that we get just in the media and entertainment industries?
Well, there's a real problem here in America, much more than is true in other Western countries, in Europe, in the UK, etc. Americans are deluged with misinformation, non-information, or disinformation. At times they are given actually wrong, deceptive, false information about things happening in the Middle East or perpetrated by Middle Easterners or perpetrated by people who look like Middle Easterners but are not even Muslim. Ironically, when there's a big anti-Muslim uprising here in the States, the first people to get it are the Sikhs, because they wear turbans. They're not even Muslims, and even our even our racism is ignorant.
Yeah.
So this is my attempt to at least engage the reader in a way that would be interesting, because first and foremost it's a political thriller. It has all the prerequisite plots and twists and surprises and changes. It's been extremely positively reviewed by important people, and Kirkus Review of Books and Book Life and regular readers. My favorite feedback is, gee, Amal, it was a page turner and I learned so much. That to me is the highest compliment, because that's what I wanted to do in the first place.
Wow. I'm really excited reading it. Would you say that some of your experience as a psychologist informs this book, or is there some like hidden way that you try to import some of that wisdom?
That's a good question. Every writer's first book is, or the fancy word of saying debut novel, is based very much on their own personality and personal history, because that's what we know, and so that's what we write about. So clearly, I deliberately made 3 points of view in the book. So the world, as it progresses in the story, is seen first and foremost by this Arab American or Egyptian American woman who has a foot in both cultures, but also by her Jewish American fiance, and by a previous love affair who has become an Islamist. So I think I have woven the perceptions and the differences between these perceptions in a I hope elegant way that keeps the reader interested.
That sounds like a very good way to kind of learn about how the mind works when you're able to see different characters and really inside their heads, and the contrast between how they perceive the same situation.
Right, and definitely being a psychologist helps me do that, so that when you're in somebody else's mind, it makes sense what's going on in their mind. It's not just a caricature. The characters are all nuanced. One very positive review said that what the reviewer appreciated was that I showed Muslim women, as people who also have a religious faith, rather than just showing them as religious women who happen to also do laundry and raise kids. is an unusual thing in American literature.
Really giving like more shape to some image or archetype that people assume when they see a person in a certain way. Like it's like we don't kind of have the story behind that, and I think there's a lot of ways that the West just doesn't want to look in certain places, and maybe you point that out there.
Well, that's very well put, Dante. I think that is the issue, that to be able to see life through a kaleidoscope rather than through a binocular or a uninocular, not even a binocular.
Yeah. I'm sensing something just from, I wish I had the chance to read more of it first, but I'm sensing something like there's a theme of like this surprise and this shock that happens when we see people from cultures that are different from us or from economic backgrounds that are different from us. Can you tell about how that plays in to this book and what you're kind of trying to point out to people through that?
Well, one of the things I point out is something that I read in an introduction by a writer named Ruff, R-U-G-H, a long time ago, in which he said, poverty is not ennobling. It does not make you a better person to be poor. And it is not always picturesque. And that we tend to think of people as sort of the noble savage.
Right.
The people who have nothing are somehow better than the people who have things, because somehow they're closer to nature or closer to God. In fact, what they are, they're closer to dung on the ground and flies in the air. And that does not make them better people.
But does it make them worse people?
No, of course not.
Yeah.
But it doesn't always, stress does not always bring out the best.
Totally. No, it's like, I think poverty becomes like, if you fall past a certain point, it inevitably becomes impossible to get out of that.
Absolutely.
The force of that, it's like a suction, a downward spiral.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In America, one flat tire for a poor person means you lose your job, you can't pay your rent, you get evicted, you get eviction on your record, and then you can't rent any other place because potential landlords can look up your data and find out that you were evicted once and so won't rent to you again. That's just one flat tire.
Yeah, it's like it's a shocking reality when we think about it, and
people live so close to the edge of collapse.
Yeah. And I mean, I've had ways of getting out of situations, but I've been in moments where I'm like living in a tent, and for me that's been something that in a way it strengthened me, and in another way, like in some of those moments I did feel like less dignified, and there was some power in like being in that stance let me find a sense of power that only came from inside. And I'm actually grateful to have those experiences. But then I see other people in similar circumstances that don't have the same access to privilege in some ways, and then get they can't handle that lack of stability, and it's not just a moment, it's like a forever kind of thing.
But it's also a very, very, very big difference between experiencing what you know or believe is temporary poverty than experiencing what you know and believe is permanent poverty.
Totally.
So you're going to be poor, your kids are going to be poor, your kids' kids are going to be poor.
Yeah, and it's something that I've learned doing energy healing work, and it's backed by psychology, or somehow I read some study about seeing recurring patterns of behavior in genes somehow. But people who are born into a rich family can go into this place where they become totally broke, but they pick themselves up out of it because it's not just money or having access to it or having a resource. It's the neural pathways and the belief systems associated with having and trusting, and that regulates you in a way that you're able to actually function. Whereas if you grow up in that lack of stability, no amount of pulling you up from your bootstraps is actually going to get you to stay regulated and functioning.
Especially when you don't have boots.
Yeah. And a lot of people don't recognize that, and I think the right wing side of the spectrum especially does not recognize that, but I'm not taking any favorites or identifying with any position.
There's more than, it's really two basic ways that poor people are seen. One is it's their own fault. If they worked harder, if they saved their money, if they didn't ever have a drink, if they, were careful about every penny, they wouldn't be poor. And the other is the idea of a systematic problem, which is that capitalism creates an underclass in order for it to continue, so that it can always have poor people available to do work at substandard wages.
Yeah. So do you think that the system itself has to change across the globe, and what would the shift in mindset be?
Well, it has to, first of all, be recognized that how much of these things are interrelated. And I don't want to overuse the current phrase of intersectionality, but in fact, these things do intersect with each other. The banking system is a system of its own, and the corporate system is a system of its own, but the two systems interact with each other in a way that supports each other's continuance. The bank will give favorable rates to corporations that it won't give to you and I, or you and me. So it's clear that there's a mutual understanding between the large corporate entities, whatever they may be.
Totally. Yeah. But I you know what? There is that overarching greed and ignorance that drives these systems, and I feel like psychologically addressing that in others and in ourselves is the first step. Because I've seen, what you were initially saying about there's a lot of people that associate having less with nobility and having more, being on the upper class, with being evil inherently. And I think that as we go through the later stages of this capitalism thing, there's more and more people that are falling into these belief systems. And I see it a lot in the LGBT community, where people are just up in arms against things rather than recognizing that, oh, well, the same thing, the same poison that fuels the system is in me, and I'm directing that towards the system. And I've been waking up out of that more and more, because it doesn't feel helpful to hate and to fear, but there is that spell in the collective consciousness the more we go through that, and there's a lot of waking up out of that to do. And I think it's coming to recognize that if you do get into that poverty level, then you're not going to have your stuff together to actually be a part of the change.
Well, I'm a social action activist, along with other things, as you see in my biography. So I would say awakening this idea of social consciousness, I would like to see that translated to boycott.
Yeah.
You know, something that is visible and that actually affects the systems that we are having so much trouble with.
Yeah.
So we can certainly demonstrate our strength by boycotting, which is one of the reasons the people who are demonstrating against Israel or pro-Palestine are also calling for divestment and boycott, are being given a particularly bad time by the schools and the police.
Yeah, it's very important to boycott and just not support those systems that are creating that violence in the world.
Perhaps it might be useful if somebody from the progressive side would make a public statement saying, you know, we made a mistake calling for defunding the police. That was a stupid thing to say.
Why do you say that?
Because I think it was a stupid thing to say. If you go into poor neighborhoods don't want the police defunded. They want the police regulated, and they want the police to be respectful and accountable. They don't want no police. They need the police.
Yeah, I understand that. Living in some places in Philly, for example, Philadelphia can be pretty wild, and you know, that was a place that I didn't feel afraid of cops necessarily, because there's other things to watch out for. But you know, I was curious as we were starting to touch on this Gaza and Israel crisis, genocide, and I got to a point with trying to argue with people about this, and it's plain as day. What's happening is plain as day, and if you look at the history and have any sense of logic and intelligence, to me it's like you see what's up. But then I've noted that intelligence and logic doesn't work with people, and so I felt like I've lost a lot of energy, because there was this sort of, it was well intended, it was feeling this compassion for the pain of the world, but I was very much like in this sort of blind attempt to convince people that would never work. And I'm curious what you think about that.
One of the reasons is that it no longer works. It used to work in my generation. When we demonstrated, we could have people who we disagreed with, one of our biggest progressive, Mario Savio, stood up on the car of his opponent to give a speech, but he took his shoes off so that he wouldn't scratch the car.
Oh.
You wouldn't see that today. There's no respect for the other.
No.
And words have become so politicized and so misused that it drives me nuts. The word, I'm really glad they're saying, the legislature says we should call anti-Semitism illegal or whatever it was that passed. I personally think that word is so loaded that it should not be used, period. And I don't want it used on me.
Yeah.
And it's used on me all the time.
Yeah.
Because as an Arab American, if I criticize Israel's actions, I'm called an anti-Semite immediately. And that's like painting me black and then calling me a nigger. Excuse my words.
Exactly, it's not a really
So
fitting
it's
word.
not. It's a word that is now designed to be painful and to hurt and to stop all conversation.
Yeah.
Once that word is used when I'm talking, I have no further conversation.
Yeah.
Nothing more I can say.
Totally. Yeah, it becomes very difficult at that point, and I think there's a growing number of these things in our world. Like a couple of years ago, it would be being dismissed as a conspiracy theorist, and it's like we need. What do you think is at the core of this divisive seed that is just growing in our modern consciousness? If you're saying people weren't as divided and weren't as willing to battle for their beliefs, why is that on the rise?
Because people are feeling and are in fact more and more powerless.
Yeah.
And when you are feeling powerless and are in fact powerless, when your sentiments are not reflected in the people that you elect, in which you have a Supreme Court that is so different in its ideology from the peoples it supposedly protects and represents. You cannot govern that way.
Yeah.
You cannot run a country where the institutions are so divided and distant from the populace. You just cannot run it. It ain't no way to run a country.
Sure ain't. Some really deep things to consider. Important conversations, I think, for people to look at. I don't know if there's anything on the top of your head that you want to elaborate upon that feels like
I just want
deep to your heart at this time.
Deep to my heart is the issue of what it's like to go from a third world country, or what we now call rather than an underdeveloped country, we call them now overexploited countries. To go from an overexploited country to the country that is exploiting it and enjoy the benefits of that exploitation, and then to go back to where you're being exploited. It's a very painful experience, and to see how you yourself have changed, and to see also what your older self was like. For example, the biggest pain for me is when I get to Egypt, the first 10 people on the sidewalk putting their hands out, begging for money, clutch at my heart. Within 2 weeks, I stopped seeing them because there's so many of them. There's nothing I can do about it. It's just too painful, so I don't see them. What I say is, it is not a pleasure to walk through someone else's poverty to get to your mansion. And that's the part that was the hardest for me.
I resonate with that. Having traveled so many countries, 29 I guess, and it's like my life is a dream compared to the lives of the people serving me, and with an amount of money that if I translated it into an American lifestyle would be like around the poverty line, I can live with all my needs met and thrive in other places. And it's been, 13 years of, I think that's too many, 11 was the number, 11 years of living like this, and it wasn't easy at all at first, and I was like on the edge of poverty for some years, just getting to points where like, oh well, I'm not eating as much, or I'm feeling constantly under a sense of threat. But the unconventional and novel thing about it really kept me really invested in it. But then when it got better and easier, I just noticed that there's this guilt that has to be tended to, and I can only tend to it by humbling myself and remembering the point of what I'm doing is service, and not losing that and kind of falling into a different story, different attachment.
It's easy to do.
Yeah, very easy to fall out of that.
And that's why you can see that the systems are so strong. It's because they know how to vacuum at the spot in which you are most vulnerable.
Yeah, but I think there's a flip side to what we were talking about, though, and this is why people who don't have the experience of going to these countries should either go to them or buy a book like this one, Escape to Aswan, so that you can get a peek into it. Is that because once you see it and you see the way that people live and the way that they deal with stress, it helps us to snap out of a lot of our Western problems. Because I was talking to an Indian friend about this recently, and she was saying, like, because I said that, all the horrors that you can imagine about India that you've heard about or seen do happen, and you see people that don't have their arms or legs working in the middle of the street begging, and all sorts of things that could be even worse sometimes. But the energy is one where you don't feel people have depression or anxiety, and that's because life asks them to respond quickly, because they don't have time to think about and ruminate and zone out into their minds on why poor me, because everyone's in the same boat and they just have to do it. And that sense of community is there. And so of course there are people who are suffering really deeply, a suffering that's worse than what people in this culture think. But I think if you see that, and if you see that if you were really living a tough life that wasn't just tough in your head, you wouldn't have these problems, you won't be the same person, I think.
And that point of view is really what you're talking about, is acceptance. Is supported in those areas by a complex set of religious and social beliefs
Yeah.
that hold the person up while they are down.
Yeah. And our culture in America is stripped of a lot of spirit.
We don't have community, for one thing.
No.
Well, there must be a happier note to end on.
Oh, yeah. So I'm curious now. What I want to say or ask is, if there's one piece of life advice, and maybe it ties in with the other things that you've talked about, or maybe it doesn't. There's one piece of life advice that's like the cherry on the top of the pie that you've got to recently that you feel like you could impart to people who are at earlier phases in their life and still haven't gone on the journey, what would that be?
Laugh, laugh, laugh.
I love to laugh.
Life is totally absurd,
Yeah.
and if you take it seriously, you'll die.
Yeah.
So just look at it and laugh.
If you lighten up, you might die in a way that your ego ceases to be the thing you thought it was. Anything to say on that?
Whatever.
But it's a better kind of death than the actually dying, and she means it, that if you don't lighten up, you probably will.
You can't make it if you do. If you do. Life is far too serious to be taken seriously.
Yeah. So enlighten up, and you can find Escape to Aswan on Amazon.
And any
Yeah.
local bookstore.
Any local bookstore. And yeah, anything else?
And my dog Truffles says goodbye to you too.
Goodbye,
Goodbye.
Truffles. Thank you so much, Amal.
You're very
Thank you,
welcome.
everybody, for tuning in, and
Thank you for having
let us know what you think. And if you have any other questions for her, maybe we'll send them her way. Blessings.
Thank you. Bye.
Bravo, you two.